Welcome to this explainer. Today we're taking a really deep contemplative look at the unseen cognitive architecture that dictates human behavior. Specifically, we're going to unpack the exact psychological mechanisms that determine why some people take extraordinary calculated risks to achieve greatness, while others remain chronically and sometimes tragically stuck in failing positions. Now let me be clear right up front. This isn't a conversation about vague motivation or generic self-help. Not at all. We are going to strictly analyze the biological and mathematical wiring of human decision-making, drawing directly on the deeply profound principles of prospect theory. So let's really dive into this together, because the ultimate paradox of human strategy is actually hidden right beneath our everyday choices, silently pulling the strings.
I want you to start by confronting a very stark mathematical gamble. Really put yourself in this position. Imagine you're forced to make this choice right now. Option A, you lose $900 for sure. No way out. It's just gone. Or option B, you take a gamble. You have a 90% chance to lose $1,000, but you have a 10% chance to lose absolutely nothing. I want you to pause for a second and really feel the psychological pull of that choice. The cold mathematical reality is that the gamble is objectively worse. Its expected value is a loss of $900, but the added risk of losing a full $1,000 makes it the inferior choice. Yet, if you're like the vast majority of human beings, you feel a desperate, almost magnetic attraction to that gamble, don't you? You desperately want that 10% sliver of hope to escape the pain of the certain loss. But why? Why is our wiring like this? To truly understand why you've felt that invisible pull, we have to look at the stark mirror image of human behavior. It's fascinating. When we are facing a sure gain, say you're being handed $900 for sure versus taking a 90% chance to win $1,000, we suddenly become incredibly timid. We become intensely risk-averse. We lock in that sure thing immediately because we are absolutely terrified of that 10% chance of walking away with nothing. But when we face a sure loss, our entire psychological operating system just completely flips. We suddenly transform into reckless, desperate risk seekers. We will eagerly take mathematically terrible odds just to avoid the agonizing, definitive reality of accepting a loss. This counterintuitive asymmetry, this is the very engine of human irrationality.
What we're unpacking here is essentially the ultimate map of our irrational mind. It's an S-shaped curve of value. Think of the vertical axis as psychological value, literally, how good or bad something feels in your gut, and the horizontal axis as the objective, cold, hard numbers of gains and losses. Notice how it is absolutely not a straight rational line, but more importantly, pay close attention to the drastic difference in the slope. The curve plunging downward into the domain of losses is vastly steeper, like a cliff face, compared to the curve rising gently into the domain of gains. This is the biological reality of loss aversion. Simply put, the psychological agony of losing $100 is far, far more intense than the psychological joy of gaining $100. We are evolutionary organisms, hardwired over millennia to treat threats as overwhelmingly more urgent than opportunities.
So let's methodically break down the 3 silent operating characteristics that manipulate practically every strategic and financial choice we ever make. Step 1 is the reference point. You see, we don't evaluate our wealth objectively. We evaluate it relative to a status quo. A departure from that neutral anchor dictates our entire reality. Step 2 is diminishing sensitivity. The subjective, emotional difference between losing $900 and losing $1,000 feels much smaller to us than the difference between losing $0 and losing $100. And step 3 is loss aversion. As we just discussed, the pain of a loss hits us essentially twice as hard as the pleasure of an equivalent gain. When you combine these 3 steps, they entirely hijack our logic.
And this is absolutely crucial because it brilliantly illustrates how those steps create a powerful cognitive illusion. Because of diminishing sensitivity, that curve we talked about starts to flatten out as the numbers get bigger. The psychological pain of a $900 loss is agonizing, but the pain of a $1,000 loss doesn't feel proportionately worse, does it? It feels only slightly worse in your mind. So your brain automatically calculates a false equation. The certain immediate agony of the $900 loss feels massive, while taking on that extra $100 risk feels completely trivial. This psychological flattening is the exact reason why a catastrophic gamble feels so acceptable to us. The immediate pain of the sure loss is a brick wall, and we will do literally anything to avoid walking into it.
Let's transition into part 1, the anatomy of a sure loss and the devastating real-world disasters it creates.
We are moving now from abstract psychological theory right into the gritty, actual battlegrounds of life, leadership, and business. Think deeply about this concept. Risk-taking of this kind often turns manageable failures into disasters. This right here is the profound tragedy of the desperate gamble. When individuals or even massive organizations are backed into a corner, their sheer inability to swallow their pride and accept the small, contained defeat virtually ensures their total destruction. They physically cannot accept the sure loss, so what do? They risk everything they have left on a deeply unfavorable, desperate gamble.
The really crucial point here is understanding the exact sequence of this destruction. It always starts with rejecting the painful certainty of a sure loss. Then, the mind begins to aggressively, almost illusionally, overweight that tiny sliver of hope, that 5 or 10% chance that some miracle will swoop in and grant complete relief. Think of a failing business. Instead of systematically closing down, paying creditors, and preserving a fraction of their capital for the future, the leadership burns their few remaining assets on a doomed Hail Mary marketing campaign. Or think of a defeated general in a war, throwing wave after wave of soldiers into an entirely futile battle, simply to avoid the personal humiliation of surrendering. Defeat is just so difficult to accept that they will fight long past the point where the mathematical reality of their destruction is already certain.
Which brings us naturally to the formal definition of the sunk cost fallacy. It's the very human decision to invest additional resources into a losing account simply to justify your earlier mistakes while completely ignoring the fact that those resources could be used for much better future investments. Whether it's you deciding to drive for hours into a highly dangerous blizzard purely because you already paid for the concert tickets, which, let's be honest, we've all kind of considered at some point, or a CEO burning $60 million to save a doomed software project instead of pivoting to a profitable one, the underlying mechanism is completely identical. You are driving into the blizzard because the psychological humiliation of closing that mental account on a costly failure is just too painful for your ego to bear.
Now, let's look at part 2, the architecture of framing, and how mere words can entirely override objective reality.
We all really like to believe that our choices are based on objective reality. But let's take a look at a classic experiment. Imagine you were given 50 pounds. In the first scenario, you were asked to choose between keeping 20 pounds for sure or taking a gamble. In the second scenario, you were asked to choose between losing 30 pounds for sure or taking that exact same gamble. Now, mathematically speaking, keeping 20 pounds from a total of 50 leaves you with 20 pounds. Losing 30 pounds from a total of 50 also leaves you with exactly 20 pounds. They are perfectly identical objective outcomes. Yet, when the word keep is used, human beings are incredibly risk-averse. They take the sure thing. But when the word lose is used, they suddenly become reckless, risk-seeking operators and take the gamble.
The takeaway from this is absolutely profound. A truly rational operator, an unemotional calculating machine, would view keep 20 and lose 30 as perfectly synonymous. But the human mind is not an unemotional machine. Our fast, automatic, intuitive mental operating system, what we call System 1, is entirely hijacked by the emotional trigger of a negative frame. Our tendencies to either approach safety or dive headfirst into reckless risk are evoked entirely by the specific words presented to us. Our choices, tragically, are often not bound by reality at all. They are entirely bound by the frame. And it's critical to understand that this cognitive flaw extends far beyond simple financial puzzles. In a very famous experiment, elite physicians were asked to evaluate different treatments for lung cancer. When surgery was framed with a survival rate of 90%, it was overwhelmingly preferred over radiation. But when that exact same statistic was reframed as a mortality rate of 10%, the preference for surgery completely plummeted. Just the word mortality triggered a profound emotional aversion, causing highly trained, highly educated doctors to make drastically different life or death strategic recommendations based purely on the manipulation of statistics. If elite physicians are captive to frames, we have to admit that we are all captive to frames.
So let's move to part 3, the operator's mindset and how we actually make objective decisions.
The big question is, how do we escape this? The very first step to achieving strategic mastery and overriding this biological flaw is adopting a surprisingly simple, almost cliched mantra. You win a few, you lose a few. This is the incredible power of aggregating gambles. Our deepest, most persistent flaw is that we look at every single decision in a very narrow, emotionally charged, isolated frame. We treat every small loss as a life or death failure. But a true operator broadens the frame. They don't look at one risk in a vacuum, they see a broad, objective portfolio of risks spread out over an entire lifetime or an entire career. When you can train yourself to view a current gamble as merely one of 1,000 you will take over the next 20 years, the paralyzing emotional sting of a single isolated loss completely vanishes. So here are the precise analytical tools that true leaders use to sever their emotional attachment to a sure loss. First, You must treat sunk costs as strictly zero. What's gone is gone. It literally does not belong in your current math. Second, broaden the frame to aggregate your risks, exactly as we just discussed. Third, evaluate choices purely on their future consequences. Never, ever make a choice today just to justify a mistake you made yesterday. Fourth, actively rewrite your internal reference point. If you are down $50,000, your new baseline is zero. Accept it. And finally, refuse the passive acceptance of a misleading frame. Whenever someone presents you with a choice, mentally reword it. Turn lives lost into lives saved, turn lose into keep, and just see if your intuition changes. This is how you transform desperate emotional gambles into cold, calculated strategy.
Which leaves us with this final, truly lingering question. As you step away from this explainer today, and as you face the inevitable complexities of your life, your career, and your business, I want you to ask yourself, are your choices truly bound to reality, or are you unknowingly reacting to the invisible architecture of a frame? The next time you find yourself desperately wanting to double down on a losing position or throwing good money after bad, stop, step back, recognize the biological illusion that is actively pulling at you, accept the sure loss with grace, and preserve your capital to fight another day. Thank you so much for joining me in this deep dive, and please keep questioning the architecture of your decisions.